I stood at the edge of the old barn with a rusted key trembling in my hand. And some are made to protect a secret, so dark it could destroy everything we ever believed about our life together. My name is Claire Whitfield, and for 11 years I was married to a man named Daniel Whitfield, a quiet, steady man who worked as a mechanic in our small town in Ohio. Daniel was the kind of husband who fixed squeaky doors before I even noticed them and remembered how I liked my coffee without ever being told twice. We built a modest life together on a piece of land his family had owned for 3 generations, complete with a farmhouse, a small garden, and an old wooden barn standing at the far edge of the property, half swallowed by ivy and shadow. That barn had always been locked. Not just closed, but padlocked with a heavy iron chain, the kind of lock that seemed excessive for a structure, holding nothing but old farm equipment, or so I assumed. Early in our marriage, I had asked Daniel why he kept it sealed so tightly, and his face had changed in a way I had never seen before. A flicker of something between fear and sorrow crossing his eyes before he answered. He told me it belonged to his father, and that some things were better left undisturbed. And then he asked me, with a seriousness that startled me, to promise him I would never open it. No matter what happened, no matter how curious I became. I loved him, so I promised. And for over a decade, I kept my word without ever asking again. Daniel passed away last spring after a sudden heart attack while working underneath a truck in our garage. I found him there, and no amount of time has fully erased that image from my mind. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of casseroles from neighbors, condolence cards, and a silence in the house so heavy it felt like another presence entirely. I moved through my days on autopilot, tending the garden he used to help me plant, feeding the 2 dogs he used to walk every evening, and trying to remember how to breathe without him beside me. It was nearly 2 months after the funeral when Daniel's sister, Margaret, came to visit from Columbus. Margaret had never been especially close to me, and there had always been a strange tension between her and her brother that neither of them ever explained. During her visit, she wandered near the barn one afternoon and stood there for a long time, staring at the padlocked door with an expression I could only describe as haunted. When I asked her what was wrong, she simply said that some doors are better left shut. And then she changed the subject so quickly that my curiosity, dormant for 11 years, suddenly roared back to life. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the promise I had made, and about the strange look on Margaret's face, and about the way Daniel's voice had trembled all those years ago. I told myself that Daniel was gone now, that the promise had been for his sake while he was alive, and that perhaps understanding whatever secret he carried might actually bring me closer to him rather than betray him. I told myself many things that night, trying to justify what I already knew I was going to do. By sunrise, I had made my decision. I was going to open that barn. I found the key in an old cigar box in his workshop, buried beneath receipts and spare bolts, as though he had hidden it there, specifically so I would never stumble upon it by accident. My hands shook as I walked across the yard that morning, the grass still wet with dew, the autumn air sharp against my face. The padlock resisted at first, stiff with years of rust, but eventually it gave way with a groan that seemed to echo across the entire property. I pulled the heavy wooden door open, and dust poured out into the morning light like smoke escaping a long-sealed tomb. Inside, the barn was dim and smelled of old hay, motor oil, and something else I could not immediately identify. Something faintly metallic and stale. Sunlight cut through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating shapes covered with tarps and old blankets. My heart pounded as I stepped further inside, my eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness. There was an old workbench along one wall, covered in tools untouched for what looked like decades. In the far corner sat a rusted truck, tires flat and windows fogged with grime. Clearly the same vehicle Daniel had mentioned once belonged to his father. It was beneath a tarp near the back wall that I found the wooden trunk. It was old, its hinges corroded, its surface scratched as though it had been dragged rather than carried. My hands trembled as I knelt beside it, some instinct warning me that whatever lay inside was the true reason this barn had remained forbidden for so many years. I lifted the lid slowly, the hinges shrieking in protest, and inside I found a stack of yellowed letters tied together with twine, a faded photograph of a young woman I did not recognize, and a small leather journal with Daniel's father's initials carved crudely into the cover. I sat down right there on the dusty floor and began to read. And what I discovered over the next hour rearranged everything I thought I understood about the family I had married into. The letters revealed that Daniel's father, a man named Walter Whitfield, had been involved in a terrible accident decades earlier, one that had never been reported to authorities, and had been buried by the family. Out of shame and fear, a young woman, the one in the photograph, had died on this very property under circumstances the family had covered up entirely, protecting Walter from consequences that should have followed him for the rest of his life. Daniel had discovered this truth as a teenager, according to the journal entries written in his own handwriting years later, tucked among his father's papers as though he needed to confess it, somewhere even if he could never speak it aloud. He had carried this knowledge silently for his entire adult life, sealing the barn not to protect himself, but to protect me from the horror of knowing that the land we lived on, the life we built together, existed atop a secret so dark it had poisoned his family for generations. He had wanted to shield me from the guilt, the shame, and the questions that would inevitably follow. And in his own broken way, that silence had been an act of love. I sat in that barn until the sun began to set, the letters scattered around me, tears streaming down my face for reasons I could barely untangle. I grieved for Daniel all over again, understanding now the weight he must have carried every single day of our marriage, smiling at me over breakfast while hiding a truth capable of shattering everything. I also felt a strange, aching compassion for the young woman in the photograph, a stranger whose story had been erased by people too afraid to face what they had done, her memory reduced to a secret hidden in a locked barn for nearly 50 years. In the days that followed, I made a decision that I believe Daniel, wherever he is now, would understand even if he might not have chosen it himself. I contacted local authorities and shared what I had found, providing the letters and the journal as evidence, allowing the truth about that long-forgotten young woman to finally come into the light after decades of silence. It was not about punishing anyone still living, since Walter had passed away years earlier, but about giving that woman back her name, her story, and the dignity that had been stolen from her the moment her death was buried beneath lies and fear. Margaret was furious when she learned what I had done, insisting I had broken a sacred family trust by exposing something buried so deliberately. But I told her what I believe with my whole heart, that secrets built on someone else's suffering are not promises worth keeping, no matter how much we loved the person who asked us to keep them. Daniel asked me to protect him, and for 11 years I did exactly that. But in breaking my promise, I finally understood him more completely than I ever had while he was alive. And I finally gave a nameless woman back the only thing that mattered, which was the truth.